Welcome to Food Integrity Now, promoting integrity in our global food supply. I'm Susan Wright, and I'm here with my two co-hosts, Carol Gervais and Matt Spaeth. Welcome.
Hi, Susan.
Good to be here.
Well, this week, we are glad to have back on the show F. William Engdahl. William was with us talking about his book in December, Seeds of Destruction, which is a history of the use of food as a weapon, and how that plays into where we are right now with genetically modified foods in the food supply. And he's back with us today. He is a historian, researcher, and he is the author of several books. He has written A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics and the New World Order, Seeds of Destruction, which I just mentioned, Full Spectrum Dominance, Totalitarian Democracy and the New World Order, which is what we want to focus on today, and Gods of Money, Wall Street, and the Death of the American Century. And I believe that he just finished and will be releasing another book. Is that right, William?
It's a book on the manufactured myth of oil scarcity or energy scarcity for the last 150 years, and how certain powerful figures such as the Rockefeller Standard Oil Trust, ExxonMobil, and so forth have used that to literally control entire nations, create revolutions, crises, wars, and so forth. So it goes into the questions such as who is really behind the myth of peak oil, how is oil really generated. We probably have enough energy in the bowels of the earth to last us for the next million years with no problem at all. So that's something that makes the Wall Street banks that finance oil drilling and Halliburton and people like that very unhappy.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, in fact, I read an article on your site, and would you give us your website for listeners who might want to go check
www.engdahl, ENGDAHL, Oil Geopolitics, all one word, Oil Geopolitics, GEOPOLITICS.net, engdahl.oilgeopolitics.net. Or if anybody Googles F. William Engdahl, you'll come to it fairly quickly.
Yeah, your article on Haiti kind of illustrates what you just said. I think it really made it clear to me, kind of how there's been this belief system set forth that that there is this scarcity, and it has interesting effects. But let's go to your book, Full Spectrum Dominance. Where does that title come from?
Well, it comes from, like many of these things, from the Pentagon PR department. It's the title they give to their mission, if you will, after the end of the Cold War, which is to have total dominance over air, land, sea, space, outer space, and cyberspace, as they put it. In other words, to control the entire universe.
Pretty
a very
ambitious.
modest agenda, and one we might ask, why do we need that if the major enemy of the Cold War has raised the yellow flag the white flag of surrender 20 years ago, namely the Soviet Union, collapsed the Warsaw Pact military alliance, dismantled the Soviet Union itself, and opened its borders up to Western investment. Why do we need this? The American military outspends the next 41 nations in the world combined. As one retired admiral, U.S. admiral, said, I think the only people we're competing with is ourselves because no one's even close. So this is really the only way to interpret it is an agenda of empire by some powerful forces who want to use that military to control the world, to loot anything that's not under their control, and use the military to do it.
So speaking of the Cold War, in your book you talk about that the Cold War is not over with. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, quite interestingly, when Gorbachev, he was the head of the Soviet Union at the time of the Reagan-Bush era, when he essentially said, we give up. We can't compete anymore. We are bankrupt financially, economically. Our people are revolting because we've had to suck them dry to feed the military competition with the United States, and you have won. So we want to have a peaceful resolution and end the Cold War. So at that point, James Baker, who was Father Bush's foreign Secretary of State, he negotiated with Gorbachev and said, we'll make a solemn pledge that the U.S. will not expand NATO to the east. And that was a Russian demand, a Soviet demand. And lo and behold, once the Soviet Union collapsed and all pandemonium broke loose in the early 90s, what happens but NATO and the U.S. start pushing NATO from one into the other, into the other, into the other former Warsaw Pact Soviet sphere countries, and uses all sorts of inducements, enticements, and so forth, security. Poland becomes a member of NATO. The Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia all become members of NATO. The Hungarians become members of NATO. The Czech Republic becomes a member of NATO. And at a certain point, it's very clear there's a very strange agenda of NATO. Why do we need NATO today? This is the year 2011. It's 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO was created as a Western, well, let's take the Hollywood PR version of NATO's creation. It was created as a counterweight to the military threat of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which actually was created as a response to NATO, by the way. So why do we need NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union? The enemy is surrendered. Why do we need NATO? Well, that question was deftly swept under the rug by Father Bush, by Bill Clinton, by George W. Bush, and certainly by Obama, who's bringing NATO to Afghanistan. He wants to have NATO around the world, it seems.
So what's the agenda on that?
Well, the agenda is, I think, madness. I think this is a strategy on automatic pilot. They don't have a plan B. The elites that, after the end of the Cold War, they said, okay, now we'll fill the power vacuum. We'll be the only force on the planet who calls all the shots. We'll set the terms. We'll create the economic conditions for American banks and American companies to come in and suck these economies dry, from China to Africa to Latin America to wherever, to Europe. And after the collapse of the subprime bubble in 2007, that agenda began to run into serious problems. And I think what we're seeing is kind of a death agony of a system that really ran off the tracks back in 1971 when Nixon took the dollar off of the gold exchange standard of Bretton Woods. And not that gold is something magical, but at that point, the U.S. had no check and balance on the creation of fiat money, except for the military power of the U.S. to blackmail Europe and to blackmail Japan and other powers to buy U.S. government debt, which is the system that exists up until now. Mm-hmm. So I think that whole system is really at the breaking point, and how that breaks. I mean, they bought a little time in 2009, end of 2009, by engineering a Greek crisis. Goldman Sachs was on the inside of that whole operation, along with the rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Ben Bernanke down there at the Fed in Washington, bad-mouthing the euro. That bought the dollar a little bit of a temporary lease on life, but it's only temporary because the debt creation of the dollar is simply, it's gone ballistic, it's out of control. And at a certain point, bond markets, pension funds, conservative investors have to take that into account.
What goes into the engineering of a crisis?